Welcome to the debate. Today we're standing at a fascinating intersection between the stories we tell ourselves and the actual biological machinery that keeps us alive. We're examining this explosion of monster culture in modern wellness, this trend of repurposing ancient myths like the werewolf, the vampire, and so on. We're asking, are these figures just aesthetic metaphors for personal empowerment and, shadow work? Or are they something far more clinical?
It's a critical distinction to make. I mean, on one side, you have the entire Instagram wellness community framing trauma as a villain era or anxiety as wolf energy. It's poetic, it's compelling, sure, and it gets millions of views. But the proposition I'm bringing to the table today is that these myths were never intended to be poetry. They were arguably the first attempts at system science, so they're not stories about identity. They are technical manuals describing exactly how the human nervous system fails under very specific types of stress.
And that really is the core tension we're exploring. I'm representing the perspective of what we're calling contemporary spiritual holism. My argument is that human beings are fundamentally narrative creatures. We structure our reality through story. Therefore, viewing trauma or personality disorders through a mythic lens, seeing the monster as a part of the self to be integrated, is a valid and maybe even an essential tool for healing and reclaiming agency.
And I'm here representing structural holism. My argument is that this narrative approach is frankly dangerous because it mistakes a symptom for an identity. I believe these figures are diagnostic categories for mechanical failure modes of the nervous system. The werewolf is a regulatory collapse. The vampire is a calcified defense mechanism. The goal isn't to integrate the monster through storytelling. It's to repair the structural constraints so the monster doesn't need to exist in the first place.
Okay, let's move into our position statements to really delineate these worldviews. I'll begin. In the realm of modern spiritual practice and depth psychology, we operate on the premise that perception constructs reality. When we speak of manifesting or vibration, we aren't necessarily talking about magic. We're talking about the reticular activating system, the brain's filter. We see what we believe.
So you view the myth as a sort of software patch for the mind?
Precisely. Take the werewolf. If someone struggles with rage or volatility, labeling it as a regulatory failure feels clinical and, alienating. But if they frame it as the wild self or the shadow, they have a container for that experience. They can engage with it. They can ask, what does the wolf want? By turning this symptom into a character, we allow the conscious mind to interact with the unconscious. We validate the experience instead of just pathologizing it. In this view, healing is an active integration, accepting the monster as a fragmented piece of the divine self.
I understand the appeal of that agency. I do. However, my position relies on source material that links these myths directly to cybernetics, the study of control systems, and to trauma neurobiology. I argue that the ancients weren't writing metaphors. They were documenting observation. They noticed that when a human is subjected to inconsistent environments, specifically that cycle of violence followed by forced normalcy, their personality structure fractures.
So you're viewing them as case studies rather than archetypes?
I'm viewing them as failure modes. The werewolf isn't a wild woman archetype to be celebrated. It's a strict model of what we now call continuity failure in complex PTSD. It describes a nervous system that cannot maintain a single identity because safety was conditional. The vampire isn't some dark empath. It is a narcissistic or antisocial structure that's defined by the refusal of limits. My stance is that by treating these states as identities to be embraced, by saying I'm in my villain era, wellness culture actually traps people in pathology. You cannot manifest your way out of a broken feedback loop. You have to fix the system constraints.
Let's get into the specifics because I think the werewolf is really the best place to test this. In the spiritual community, we see the werewolf as the ultimate symbol of the repressed self breaking free. It's the wild coming out when the civilized mask slips. We talk about the moon as this divine feminine force pulling the truth out of us. It's about accepting that we're both light and dark, and that the civilized world often suppresses our natural instincts.
And that is exactly where the structural error lies. This idea of duality, that there's a wolf self and a human self fighting for control, is a misunderstanding of the biology. The source material is very specific here. The werewolf myth is a model for a system, toggling between incompatible states.
But the experience is duality. I feel like one person at work and a completely different, maybe volatile person when I'm triggered at home.
You feel that way, yes. But structurally, it is a continuity failure. The werewolf myth describes a very specific pathogenesis, usually a curse passed down, so intergenerational trauma, or a bite, which is viral violence. The monster is not a separate entity. It's the nervous system shifting into emergency mode. When the environment is safe, you're the human, social, inhibited, moral. When the environment is threatening, the cortex, the thinking brain, shuts down, and you become the wolf. Reactive, aggressive, survival-focused.
So you're saying the wolf is just the sympathetic nervous system in overdrive?
Essentially, yes. It is a sympathetic storm. The tragedy of the werewolf isn't that they have a dark side that needs to be loved. The tragedy is that they are forced to adapt to an inconsistent reality. They cannot maintain a continuous self because the environment won't allow it.
That makes sense biologically, but let's talk about the moon. In my framework, the moon is essential. It's the call of nature, it's the cyclical aspect of our being. You can't just reduce the moon to a biological function.
Actually, in this structural framework, the moon is the most important mechanical component. The moon is not magic. The moon is a clock.
A clock?
It represents pattern recognition and trigger thresholds. Consider how trauma triggers work. The body responds to environmental cues, smells, times of year, the lighting, stress levels, faster than the conscious mind can process. The moon represents the accumulation of environmental data that tips the system from human mode to survival mode.
So when the moon is full, it's not an energy shift, it's a data overload.
It's a marker of inevitability. The system says, I recognize this pattern, the lighting is like this, the stress is like this is when the bad thing happens. Deploy defenses. It isn't a mystical energy source, it is a prediction error. The nervous system predicts danger based on a cycle.
I see the logic, but I worry about the implication for the sufferer. If we strip away the myth, we strip away the meaning. If I tell a client, you have a regulatory injury and your pattern recognition is faulty, they feel broken. If I tell them, you're learning to ride the wolf, or you're integrating your shadow, I give them a story they can work with. Placebo or not, doesn't the story help facilitate the healing?
That is the crux of it, isn't it? Does the story help or does it calcify the split? If you tell them you are part wolf, you are encouraging them to identify with the trauma response. You're validating the fragmentation. The structural goal should be integration, restoring safety so the emergency mode is no longer necessary. The werewolf doesn't need to be understood as a separate identity. The nervous system needs to learn that the war is over. The goal is to stop turning into the wolf, not to be a better wolf.
But how do we achieve that without the myth? The ancients didn't just have the moon, they had the silver bullet. In the stories, that's the only thing that stops the monster. In my view, silver represents purity, clarity, maybe the light of consciousness piercing the darkness.
I agree with the definition, but I'd apply it physically. Why silver? Structurally, silver is an elemental metal that doesn't tarnish easily. It represents truth that cannot be distorted. The hypothesis here is fascinating. A trauma-based survival system, the werewolf is essentially a distortion field. It reinterprets safety as danger. It hallucinates threats.
Because it's hypervigilant.
Exactly. To break that loop, you can't use force and you can't use regular logic. You need an intervention, a silver bullet that is so undeniably real, so factually dense that the distortion field collapses. It isn't violence, it's radical clarity. It's a fact that cuts through the delusion of the trauma response.
That is beautiful. Truth that cannot be distorted. So the cure isn't killing the self, it's introducing a reality the trauma can't deny.
Correct.
Let's pivot to the vampire because I think the contrast there is even sharper. In the wellness world, energy vampires is a huge topic. We're taught to protect our vibration, to set boundaries, or sometimes, if we're in a high vibe state, to send them love and light to heal them. It's all based on the idea that love conquers all frequencies.
And this is where the wellness model shifts from helpful to genuinely dangerous. If you try to love and light a vampire, structurally speaking, you are just feeding it. You are providing supply.
That sounds incredibly cynical. You don't believe people can change through love?
It's not cynicism, it's systems theory. The sources deconstruct the vampire not as a suffering soul, but as a calcified personality structure. This maps directly to narcissistic or antisocial personality disorder. The definition of the vampire in this framework is entitlement and the refusal of limits. This is the ordinary conditions of life: aging, decay, consequence, and reciprocity. It wants the privileges of existing without the relational footprint of accountability.
That's a very harsh reading. Surely, the vampire myth is also about loneliness, the eternal outsider. We see this in pop culture all the time, the vampire who wants to be human but can't.
That's the romanticized version that keeps victims trapped. But look at the mechanics of the original folklore. No reflection in the mirror. That isn't magic. A mirror encodes self-representation. A healthy system can model itself as an object among others. It can see itself.
Object constancy.
Exactly. A vampire has no reflection because it has no object constancy. It can't see itself objectively. It exists only as a center of hunger. It's a self-sealing world model. It cannot accept feedback from the outside world.
I want to touch on the sunlight aspect. In my framework, sunlight represents truth or maybe divine love. The vampire burns because it has lived in the dark too long. It's a purification. We often say, bring it to the light, meaning expose the secrets.
I interpret the source material differently. The darkness isn't just a place the vampire hides. Darkness is a self-generated reality field. It represents sovereignty. In the dark, the vampire is the author of reality. They decide what's true. They decide who matters.
So the darkness is their bubble of narcissism?
Yes. And sunlight? Sunlight is ontological collision.
Ontological collision. That's a heavy term. Break that down.
It means colliding with a reality you did not create. Sunlight reveals the world as it actually is, where other people exist as sovereign beings, where gravity and time apply to everyone equally. The vampire doesn't burn because sunlight is moral or holy. It burns because its structure cannot survive contact with objective reality. It's not a purification, it's a system collapse.
That's fascinating. I would argue that shared reality is what we're trying to create through intention. But I see your point. If someone is locked in a narcissistic bubble, manifesting implies they're just trying to strengthen that bubble. They're trying to make the darkness stronger.
Exactly. If a vampire tries to manifest a better reality, they're just trying to expand the darkness, their control over the narrative, so they never have to encounter the sun. They aren't trying to join the shared world. They are trying to consume it.
This leads us perfectly into the concept of the spiritual bypass, because I do believe that spiritual practices, meditation, ego death, non-duality, are the cure for these states. If a vampire or a narcissist could truly experience ego death, wouldn't that solve the problem? Wouldn't that dissolve the entitlement?
One would hope. But the vampire and Buddhism analysis in our material suggests otherwise. It argues that a vampire seeking non-existence or emptiness is actually engaging in the ultimate spiritual bypass.
How can seeking emptiness be a bypass? It's the ultimate surrender. It's the dissolution of the self.
Because the vampire is already undead. It has already exited the cycle of consequence. It wants to escape the relational footprint. Think about it. If you take a narcissist, someone who refuses to be held accountable, and you give them a philosophy that says the self is an illusion and nothing is real, you aren't curing them, you're arming them.
You're saying they weaponize the concept of non-duality?
Precisely. They use it to detach from the harm they cause. I didn't hurt you because I don't exist and you don't exist, and it's all just consciousness playing. The source says, meditation doesn't cure the vampire, it exposes the void. Real healing for a structure like that isn't transcendence, It's the opposite. It's incarnation.
Incarnation?
Yes, forcing them to feel the weight of their body, the reality of others, the limits of time. They don't need to fly higher. They need to crash land into the earth.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning. I mean, I've seen people use these practices to soften their egos, but I do concede that without a ground of psychological safety, transcendence can be a form of dissociation. However, you seem to be dismissing the intuitive aspect of healing. You prioritize mechanics over feeling. But isn't intuition, the vibes we get from people, a valid form of knowledge? When I say someone has vampire energy, I'm using intuition to navigate complexity. I'm feeling the drain on my system.
I don't dismiss intuition. I just think we mislabel it. What you call vibes is actually high-speed pattern matching. It's data processing that happens too fast for language. But my issue is with the rejection of clinical language in favor of mystical language. The argument I'm making is that the ancients, the people who wrote these myths, were more clinical than we are.
More clinical? They talked about curses, silver bullets, and garlic. That seems pretty steeped in folklore.
But look closer. Those were system constraints, encoded as physical rules. We talked about the silver bullet, but look at running water for the vampire. Why can't they cross it?
In folklore, it's usually because water is pure or holy.
In systems theory, water represents flow, time, and change. Heraclitus said, "You cannot step in the same river twice." A vampire is a fixed, calcified identity. It cannot cross into the realm of change without breaking. These aren't just spooky rules. They are preformal systems theory. They're describing the physical laws that govern psychological states.
I love that phrase, preformal systems theory. It suggests that we are all looking at the same thing. My shadow work is your integration of continuity failure. My energy vampire is your closed reality system. We're just using different lexicons.
We are pointing at the same human phenomena, yes, but the framing dictates the solution, and that is where we diverge. If you think it's a story, you try to write a better ending. If you think it's a machine, you try to fix the gears.
But can we ever truly separate the two? Humans are storytelling machines. Even if I accept that the werewolf is a nervous system state, the only way I can interact with that state is through my consciousness, which is narrative. I have to talk to myself. I have to make meaning of the shift. If I just treat myself as a broken circuit board, I lose the dignity of the experience. The placebo of the story is what allows the medicine of the mechanics to work.
There's dignity in the truth, though. There's dignity in knowing that you aren't possessed by a demon, but that your body is loyally trying to protect you from a threat that is no longer there. The danger of the story approach is that stories have villains and heroes. Systems just have functions. When we moralize these states, when we make the vampire evil or the werewolf tragic, we stop looking at the environment that created them.
And that brings us to the question of responsibility. In the manifestation community, there is a shadow side where we say, you attracted this. If a vampire enters your life, it's because your vibration matched theirs. It implies we have total control.
Which is a profound error. That is internalized blame. The structural view says the vampire enters your life because they are a predator looking for an opening, and perhaps your boundaries were compromised by previous trauma. It's not a vibrational match. It's a systemic breach. You didn't manifest it. Your security system was offline.
I see your point. We risk victim blaming when we overemphasize personal agency. But if we go too far your way, we risk total determinism. My nervous system made me do it. I'm a vampire because of my childhood structure. Where's the change? Where's the hope?
The change comes from structural accountability. For the werewolf, the trauma, the cure is safety and regulation. You don't exercise the wolf. You build an environment where the emergency mode isn't triggered. For the vampire, narcissism, the cure is the wooden stake.
Which represents?
Wood is organic. It represents mortality, life, the earth. It decays. To cure the closed system, you must pierce it with the reality of mortality. You have to force the realization of dependence and loss. It's not a high vibe cure. It's a devastating one. It's the collapse of the false self.
And that is a journey in itself. It sounds less like a healing session and more like a funeral for the ego.
It is, but that is the only way to rejoin the living.
As we wrap up, I want to reflect on where we've landed. I started this debate championing the power of myth to give us identity and meaning. You've argued that these myths are actually warnings against turning dysfunction into identity.
Exactly. We must stop treating these figures as identities to be embraced, like putting trauma survivor or villain era in a bio. We need to see them as regulatory failures to be repaired. The goal is not a better story. The goal is a functioning system that can connect with others.
I accept the precision of the structural view. It is grounding. But I maintain that the experience of the sufferer is fundamentally narrative. You can't heal a human being solely with mechanics. We need the silver bullet of truth, yes, but we also need the moon of meaning to understand the tides of our own lives. Vibes alone can't fix a broken nervous system, but meaning-making remains essential for recovery. We need the poetry to tolerate the mechanics.
Perhaps. I would leave the listener with this thought. Modern psychology and ancient myth, they're the same human intelligence modeling itself with different tools. The question is, when you look at these myths, are you looking for a costume to wear or a map to get out of the labyrinth?
That is the question. Are you trying to manifest a new reality to escape your pain, or are you brave enough to step into the sunlight of shared existence?
And survive the collision.
Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Thank you.